Hi, I'm Tracy Kitten with Information Security Media Group at Information Security Media Group's Fraud Summit in New York. I'm talking with Andy Smith of Equifax. Andy, today we've had some discussions, we're only halfway through the day, about retail breaches, the emergence of EMVs, some of the migration of fraud that we might see. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we can expect in the wake of data breaches. We know that card information has been exposed, but there's been a lot of personally identifiable information that's been exposed, which ultimately is going to lead to new account fraud through the use of synthetic identities, identity theft. What do you think we can expect to see?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see is, as it becomes more difficult to do traditional counterfeit credit card fraud due to the EMV shift, we're going to see that fraud migrate to online channels for transactions, as well as application fraud channels. The identity information that's available is, to apply for an account, of course, you need that personally identifiable information. So the fact that it's gone beyond just your basic card breach is fairly significant.
So let's look at it from the banking institution perspective. I could use any organization really, but I'll use banks as an example. What do banks need to do to determine whether or not they have someone who's trying to open a new account using a synthetic identity?
Right. There's a number of techniques. The first thing I would say is you don't do just one thing. You layer your defenses. You apply the technologies that we have in place now that we didn't have 10 years ago, things like device fingerprinting and some of the other technologies, but you also need to check against the reference data and make sure that you're looking at the most reliable data, the state of knowledge on the consumer that is really the best. And the third thing that they found useful in other geographies, but hasn't really penetrated that deeply into the U.S. right now, is comparing the application data against past known frauds through a give-to-get consortium.
So let's expand there a little bit. When you say compare the application data, what do you mean?
Just the very elements of PII get reused and reused by fraudsters again and again. From an application perspective, we're able to actually catch onto a social security number that's used multiple times with different names attached to it, things like that. We break it down element by element and are able to find fraudulent applications that way.
Do you find a lot of organizations that are actually using that kind of information, that are actually tracking how often a social security number is used to open a new account?
What we find is institutions do it within their own four walls, but they have a great deal of difficulty going outside their four walls, especially in credit card and loan areas for financial institutions. There's just not that tradition built up in the U.S. market to be sharing that data.
So do we see that kind of data sharing in other markets?
We do. Probably our best experiences in Canada and UK. In UK, it's the law that institutions have to share their fraud data. And in Canada, it's just been the convention among financial institutions for the past 8 years, 10 years.
So do you think that we might see that take place here in the U.S. as we're kind of moving into this new environment of faster payments, EMV, we're trying to shore up our security? Do you think we might see more sharing?
Yeah, I think we will. I think what we'll see is a rise in application fraud in particular, as well as card not present fraud, but it'll be most notable in application fraud. The fraudsters are going to react faster than the institutions, most likely. That tends to be the way that it's going to run, but you're going to see losses run up, and then I think you're going to see institutions looking for answers. And the most obvious answer right now is being able to share that data across institutions.
So let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, Andy, and that's EMV, of course. So now we're about a month into the EMV liability shift here in the U.S. I think it's probably going to take us a good 60 to 90 days before we actually see the impact on merchants.
Right.
But what about the transition or the migration of fraud? What do you think we could see over the course of the next 90 to 120 days?
Yeah, I think you're going to see, there's three things that I think you're going to see. I think you're going to see a movement away from credit card fraud, which is a little bit concerning because credit card fraud is one of your least severe ways. But we're already seeing, for instance, auto lending fraud getting more prevalent. Mortgage fraud, we're seeing rises in that, move towards defrauding commercial accounts. The other thing that we're going to see is a move to application and account takeover, identity-related versions of fraud. And probably the third thing you're going to see is going to be the move to online channels to avoid having to swipe that card.
So it's interesting that you brought up account takeover. In one of the sessions that actually preceded us sitting here talking, they talked about an uptick in the UK when they made the move to EMV in the online banking fraud. So account takeovers there. So I guess we can expect to see the fraud go back to that channel. We've kind of shored that up with some of the FFIEC authentication guidance and some of the techniques that banks have put in place to enhance authentication. But the fraudsters are always a step ahead.
Yeah, I think we've got lots of experience to see what's going to happen. The UK market isn't substantially less sophisticated than the US market. They're the same market essentially, and the fraudsters have figured it out, and they'll operate in the US as well.
The same way. And something else I wanted to ask you about, you had mentioned that European and Canadian banks had been sharing nodes across borders, and this was something that they were doing in the wake of EMV and where they saw some of these upticks in ID fraud, card not present fraud. Were there any other areas that they saw upticks in fraud, such as the ATM channel, for instance?
ATM defenses have been they're pretty well established and pretty well shored up. I guess what I would say is really it's migration towards other financial instruments is the thing that I would add to the card not present and the application fraud within credit card.
Do you think we could see upticks in fraud that's perpetrated against Apple Pay, for instance? I know from an authentication standpoint there were some concerns there initially.
Yeah.
A lot of that's been resolved at this point, but do you think that could be something that fraudsters focus on in the future?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think there's at that point of account provisioning, it's interesting in that there's another opportunity to make a fraud decision about an applicant at that time. It's not widespread yet, though. Again, you have that tendency of the fraudsters react before the institutions that actually feel the pain.
Right. Well, Andy, I want to thank you for your time. Very informative.
Thank you, Tracy.
Again, we've just heard from Andy Smith of Equifax. For Information Security Media Group, I'm Tracy Kitten.